Hello and welcome to another video. So today we are taking a look at an Aggro Swordcraft deck. Aggro Swordcraft is probably one of the cheapest decks that you could probably use. I mean, you are only running 3 legendaries, which is fairly inexpensive for the most part, of which they are Sky Commander Celia, which I believe was one of the cards in the pre-built deck. I'm just off the top of my head, just trying to think about it. I'm pretty sure it is, so you can quite easily obtain at least one of these pretty cheaply. Most of the other cards also are included in the things like the pre-built deck. I mean, you have at least one Dragonite, those sort of cards, which are really good, and most of these cards are reasonably cheap anyway. So we're only running a nice clunky handful of golds at about 8, which is pretty reasonable. As I mentioned, the 3 legendaries and everything else is extremely cheap at bronze and silver. So your key thing for this deck will be storm and ambush damage. We've covered decks like this in the past, of course, and now bringing it back, giving a test in this current meta, and it's still doing amazingly. I played, I think, 5 games with this deck and only lost 1, which with this deck is very consistent, so it's always the way I like to go with it. It's always a very effective deck and it does the job. If you're looking for very quick games, this is the kind of deck you want. It will close out about 6 to 8 on turn wise, which is fairly reasonable, so we're going to get right into it and check it out. So with this deck, your aim always is to go for very early cards. Anything early you can get will always help you out and is going to be your biggest advantage. So I usually try to aim for a hand like this, where I can easily go into a 1, 2, 3 drop. The Celia isn't an ideal 2 drop, I really prefer to use it for 5 because that storm damage is just that important. I very rarely will use the other version of Celia, which is more defensive, as this deck relies purely on attack, so getting as much damage in as possible is what you want to do. Of course, this deck can struggle against Tenko decks, although it does pretty well now because Tenko really doesn't start going off until turn 5. So really, you can close out games around then, especially if you're going first. If you're going second, it's a little trickier, but for the most part, it's not too bad. So as you can see, starting off well, I really love the 2-for-1 card there. Going for 2 1-1s just really spreads out your damage and allows you to go for a lot more than normal. And going for as many followers on board as possible to work with Perseus to get a ward up is usually a nice strategy to go with as well. Of course, that doesn't work in our favour this time because they kind of just ruin us, but it's going to be fine. Double Quick Blader plus an Evo, it does get us the damage we want. Perseus setup as well could be quite nice, as it does open up more potential damage for Celia on turn 5, which could then be immediately followed up on our turn 6 with a Lancelot, which is an amazing Dragonite card to really be able to deal the damage you want. Personally, I found Lancelot closes out a lot of my games because people just don't see it coming. They expect the Celia to be the one to go for it, but Lancelot tends to be the way I like to do things. Fortunately though, they did wipe our board, meaning our Celia isn't going to be quite as good, so I did decide to favour Lancelot this turn and hold off to Celia hopefully next turn. Probably the turn after, honestly, because we can use Oathless Knight plus Celia to guarantee a couple extra damage, which in this case should give us lethal. Very close. And drawing Round Table is perfect because it is going to put them at 1 once we add this Evo, so even Celia without the Oathless Knight would be able to close this out. That's how effective this deck can be. While some games like this one will get dragged out because they cleared our board a couple times, most games you can close off on turn 6, and if you don't, usually Dragonites will come in handy turn 8 and you can get a lot of extra damage and extra value out of it. But most of the time your opponent is focused on clearing out your board, so you can take advantage of that and really just go face. So there we go, we've got the Oathless and Celia, which is going to be way more than enough damage to actually win this anyway, and put us in a good books. Basically setting them to 1, even if they have done a small heal, it wouldn't have been an issue for us and we still would have won that. And next up, we're actually playing against Portal. Portal, another deck this deck does fairly well against, as long as our opponent doesn't go absolutely nuts in their opener. Openers can be kind of deadly, but for the most part, puppets don't deal well with an aggro deck like this, at least in my experience. Of course, with some more playtesting, I'm sure I could refine that down, but we're covering a lot of decks in short periods of time, so I usually only can get about 10 to 15 games with the deck maximum within a couple of weeks to really learn them. But most of the decks I'll do a video on in about 5 to 10 games, depending on how the deck performs. Most of the pre-builds have been putting in a lot more work for to really get a feel for them, but overall these decks do fairly well. If you are looking for, like I said, a quick deck, this is the one for you. It'll definitely end games fast, and you can probably climb fairly easily with it, especially in the current meta. Of course, if you're looking for something with a higher win rate overall, definitely recommend something like Puppets or Tenko at the moment. Seem to be doing extremely well, and that's not that surprising. Also, Mid-Forest seems to be okay, but personally I have little success with Forest decks myself, so not something I tend to cover a lot. So starting off very solid. Like I said, getting as much damage out as you can is always beneficial. I probably could have went for the ward there, but I did decide to use the Perseus ward effect instead. I just felt like that was going to be a little bit better.
You can't make me give up.
And with a quick attack, we can pretty easily go face, get as much damage as we want. And this isn't so bad either. I mean, our Perseus is going to die, which is okay, but most likely they're still going to leave this hedgehog up, which looks like they did. And that's going to be very beneficial for us, especially since we drew this quick blader. We can now clear off a couple of these, still get the value out of them because the hedgehog will get its stats raised, and we can actually add even more storm damage with our Princess Juliet, which, when we're setting up a Lancelot for next turn, should be pretty decent. It'll be enough even without the Evo. These are the kind of matches that I really enjoy with this deck. It really shows off how quickly this deck can perform, and as I mentioned, I only actually had one loss while getting the games to make this video. And that match was mainly down to the fact that I just didn't draw the right cards. I drew mostly high-end stuff, so I drew Dragonite stuff, and really had to skip the first few turns, which was a pretty big disadvantage, honestly, skipping the first few turns. But showcasing the deck and how it works is what we do in most of our videos. That is the aim for these videos. Showcasing decks, how they function, and the best I can. And losses don't tend to do that very well. So our next game is against Haven. We do have a Rotation Cup going on, I think. Is it Rotation or only? I think it's Rotation Cup at the moment, which should be pretty exciting. Hopefully I'll have some coverage of that. I haven't tended to cover stuff like that, but we might try and cover it this time around. We'll just have to wait and see how I go with things. I do want to add some different kind of videos for you guys into the mix of these normal deck videos, but it's just at the moment a matter of time being able to physically do things. So starting off with the Oathless Knight is also very beneficial to us. It should do fairly well. Princess Juliet on 3 lines up nicely as well. Getting as much damage as you can works out wonderfully. And Haven doesn't tend to have a super strong early game here, especially against big board floody decks like this one that just continually pump followers onto the board. So I did decide to go wide because that does mean I've got more targets and more damage on board in general. Them healing for 1 each turn isn't really an issue, and they're really not going to be a problem until turn 5, where they can drop Tenko. So at this point, we're pretty much guaranteed to get 7 damage next turn, and a good chance at just dropping our 5-drop onto the board. It'll take up our couple of slots, and probably guarantee us lethal at this point. So we're going to be able to pretty easily secure this. But these are the kind of games that tend to happen most of the time. You can pretty easily flood your board every single turn, continually pump out small followers, make it hard for your opponent to deal with. I think the worst nightmare for this deck is Dragon in most cases, because they do tend to just absolutely crush the opponents with board clear, but even then, if they're wasting all their turns on board clear and you're just storming them down, the odds of you winning are still exceptionally high. So I did go for the clear, as we are just short of lethal. We're only actually a couple of damage off, which is a little disappointing. If we could have got probably one damage off. If we could have got one more thing to stick, we would have been alright, but in this case, this is the best I could probably do. So they're not going to be able to wipe us out, which is great, so this game is secured here. Even if it wasn't, the odds of me drawing a Storm card could have been fairly high, and really it would have just been buying a little bit more time. So we do have a lot of games for this video. I've got another Portal matchup. This is just going to be kind of a bonus game, as the other 3 were kind of the main ones I wanted to cover, but it turns out we're going to have enough time to really add this in, so why not? Starting off with a very solid hand, our 1 and 2 drops are going to work really nicely together. I always love having a turn 1 play, and even better, Goblin. Better to use Goblin over Perseus most of the time, unless you are aiming for the Perseus evolve effect, which a lot of the time I used to forget even has an evo, but now I've got the hang of it, remembering it isn't so bad. So I did start with a Hedgehog since we did draw a second one instead of going for a Ward, plus they didn't really play anything, so it wasn't going to be a problem for us. And we are going to get a chance to go for the Ward and the 1-drop Perseus play, which is a fairly beneficial play, long term. Plus, because of our Hedgehog, it's got a good body on it now. And they're really not going to be able to do much else. Even better though, we get a really nice Valse with our nice 1-drop spell to clear this up, making our Hedgehog even bigger and getting us some more damage very quickly. As I mentioned, these games are super quick. That's why we've been able to cover 4 of them in the span of just over 10 minutes. It's going to be very, very good deck overall, I think. I'm actually surprised a lot more people aren't playing it. It seems to be very consistent and does the job. I'm guessing high level play in tournaments you probably won't see it because of course these kind of decks don't usually perform amazingly in tournaments just because people tend to be able to counter them fairly easy and a lot more top tier plays, but just general laddering in Master this deck seems to do wonderfully. So with a nice evo and attack buff plus a bit of damage, setting them to 3, Lancelot is going to secure this game very easily regardless of if they clear board or not. And that's what you want to see, a nice turn 6 Lancelot win.
I'm coming to you.
You really can't go wrong with that. So they did manage to clear the board out. If we didn't have this Lancelot play, we definitely would have been in a tighter spot and it would have been a little more difficult, but we still would have had a good chance with that draw there. So always making sure to pick Lancelot just to be careful. Sometimes you don't want to accidentally click the wrong one, but it does give you a lot of options, and Lancelot I think for this deck is definitely the best one. So there isn't a lot more to say for this deck, as I mentioned pretty much throughout the video. Really strong deck, very effective, reasonably cheap, and that's about it. So if you guys did enjoy this video, hit the like button and subscribe. You will find the deck list in the description below, and I will catch you guys next time. See ya.